All right. Well, happy, I think it's Wednesday for most of us. So UX Showcase for Foundations. I'm Jeremy Elder. I'm a staff product designer and on the Foundations team. And I'm going to discuss drop downs today. And three main kind of categories or topics related to drop downs would be just a component timeline. So where have drop downs been? Where are they going? Get into the weeds a little bit with some semantics, and then lastly, wrap up with a bit of talk on design. So specific to one of our components. All right, so a little bit about timeline. Historically, we've kind of used the term, or not kind of, we have used the term drop down to mean basically anything that triggers opening a panel. And so in yesterday's lingo, if you will, everything was a drop down. And so I started to take a look at the drop downs, and I know this has been a kind of an underlying theme that we've had of when to use what and how do we build it out in Figma to accommodate all the needs. And I also did an accessibility audit of the component in GitLab UI and realized that our dropdowns are under the hood just as kind of formless, if you will, for lack of a better term, as our description of them. And so through the accessibility audit and some research, determined that we need to be more specific with what does a dropdown actually mean and how is it used? How is a user going to encounter it? There's a lot of accessibility implications when we just throw out the term dropdown. And so today's state, we have actually four different variants of a dropdown. And if you go to Pajamas, you'll see those reflected. Each of those have a page with like a greater detail and description than I'll go into today. But we've broken these out into four different variants, and that is a disclosure, a combo box, a menu, and a list box. And I'll get into the semantics and the weeds with those a little bit. And the reason for that is because they each have a different use case. They're each developed differently, and they have different keyboard controls and different meanings semantically. And so there's reasons to do this. And then where we're headed tomorrow would be to actually treat the list box as a subcomponent, because as you'll see, it's really something that is actually part of a disclosure or a combo box. And if you don't know what those mean, I'll get into that as well. So tomorrow we will have even a further reduction in dropdowns, but they will be more clear. And just to get into the semantics, so like I mentioned, the term dropdown, it generally refers to an element that reveals a related panel, but this is like mystery box. Like, what does that mean? How would I develop this? How would I design this? Excuse me, it's not very specific. And so we can blow that away and do better with that. And that's why we have these four: disclosure, list box, combo box, and menu. And I'll walk through each of these with a brief definition, cover some of the key semantics, not everything, and then use cases. So starting out with the disclosure. And a disclosure widget includes a button that opens a panel of links or actions. And so right off the bat, the definition is meant to be clear that, okay, there's a button involved and there's a panel of links or actions. And so now we're starting to provide a little more definition to that. And under the hood, what this looks like is there's an actual semantic button, performs an action. It's coded as such. And it has ARIA expanded true, which is basically the ARIA controls that say, okay, this panel is open. If it was collapsed, it would be false. And then it references the ID of the panel that it is acting upon. And so disclosure is pretty much the most common of all of the options. And the reason for that is because it's somewhat a catch-all, right? Accordion is a form of a disclosure. A popover should be a form of a disclosure. It's not today, but it should be. And so this concept relates to all of that, where you have a button that's triggering a panel. That panel can contain content. It's really good for navigation, mega menus. And then it's good for a mix of links and actions, where I'll get into it in a minute, where menu is more specific on actions and functions. And so a disclosure is the first one that we broke this out into. And like I mentioned, it opens a panel of links or actions. It's really good for navigation. And at the moment, the current build as we have it in GitLab UI is that it's just a list of items. There's no header or footer. There's no slots for those, that extra content. And this is the most common. So during our migrations, our most common implementation will probably be a disclosure. So second is a list box. And a list box is a panel of options, typically opened by a button or a text input. And the reason that it's opened by a button or a text input is the very need to break out list box in the future into its own kind of subcomponent, because it's part of a composite, if you will, that can be inserted into multiple forms because of how it's accessed. And a list box, it's actually like an ARIA role that is actually list box. And so it's got semantic meaning. When you hit this with a screen reader, there's understood semantics there. It actually has very specific use case. So if you have a role list box, then the immediate children have to be role options. And then those options have, ARIA selected. There's other things like active descendant, so that a user will know, okay, these are the selected options. If it's single, multi, whatever, they'll have that clued in to them and have that meaning. This is triggered, in this case, today's state list box is triggered by a button. It'll let you know the states of the panel, if it's expanded or not. The ARIA has pop-up, indicates that, okay, it's got a list box. That's what it's going to activate and what it controls, this panel. Not every screen reader uses this ARIA controls, but it is helpful to have for those that do. And so our panel becomes an ordered list, but the semantics have changed. We removed that meaning and applied the role list box to it. There's also the role options that are in there. So each list item would actually have a role option. For a while, we were looking at doing actual form elements where we'd have buttons or selects, checkboxes, radios, whatever, not a select, checkbox or radio in there. But it actually should be a list item with role option and then that content in there. So there's no further child content other than text at the moment. But the use cases would be for a list of single or multi-select options. So think of our labels and being able to choose a label in a dropdown, being able to choose a milestone, et cetera. So a lot of those things on the right sidebar and issuables. And you would use a list box in place of select, like the native select form element, when these options need to include more formatting. So things like images or multi-lines of text, a large number of options where select might not be the best to sort through. And speaking of sorting, where you might actually want to search and filter through this list, that's where a list box is ideal. And right now, it does have the option to have the optional header and or footer, like the fixed footer with some additional actions. You've probably seen that in the sidebar. And this is common. This is probably next to disclosure, one of our most common migrations that'll happen. And we'll actually be using this more than like a select menu. And so Austin, to your question, the reason for using list box instead of select is because many of our options have avatars. They have other things that are part of the attribute of that option, whereas a select is single, just text. And so this extends that, makes it more more ability to be styled and have more options, search, sort, etc. Third up is a combo box. And a combo box it's a widget, and it includes a text input that controls a list box of options. So again, providing more definition here. Combo box is actually a semantic item with an ARIA role. So we have our, let's see here where we got it. Our input has the role of combo box. It's essentially just saying, hey, this is a combination of things. It's a composite component. And it controls a list box of options. So again, bringing in that list box, that's why that's going to be abstracted out, because list box is part of this composite. What makes a combo box different is that it's triggered by an actual input. It can also be triggered by a button if you've seen these, but the input itself, it could be autocomplete. or just a free-form type, or it can be a specific match. And that's what triggers the panel to open. And that panel again has role list box and then the options, etc. And we would use this to, to toggle and search through a list box of single or multi-select options. So again, labels is a good example. It does have the optional header and footer, and it is pretty common in our UI. So last up is a menu. And counter to its name, it's not used for navigation, and I'll go into that in a second. But a menu, it contains a list of app-like JavaScript actions or functions. So this is why it's not ideal for navigation, is because it's meant to mimic application type behavior. So if you think of copying, pasting, if you think of other functions that an application might do, if you're doing that in a website, a web app, that's when you would use a menu. It's when everything in that menu is an actual function or action that is performing, some JavaScript behavior. So the thing that's unique about the menu is that it states, the button itself states that it ARIA has pop-up menu. That's specific meaning for a screen reader. It's a different type of keyboarding and controls. There's additional navigation and capabilities that happen when you're interacting with the menu. And a screen reader will switch more into application mode rather than browse and read mode. So semantically, it's even different, and the function of it is different. And so it has a very specific use case. There's an unordered list again, and that has a role of menu. And then there's a role of menu item for each list item. And so you might wonder, like, why am I going into all the semantics of these things? It's basically just to give you a peek under the hood of why these are meaningful differences and why it's important to parse those out. Because when we start to integrate these into the UI and say, oh, I need a drop down of options, we'll be able to be more specific on what is the actual purpose of this drop down. Okay, maybe it contains actions and links. Okay, then it should be a disclosure. Well, maybe it's just I'm selecting an option and I need to have that choice reflected back to the user. Then I should be using a list box or combo box, depending on how it's triggered. So it allows us to be more prescriptive in our use of a component, and it also allows more accessibility on the part of the user and being able to access that. So this is very rare in our UI, and it should be, because of the special keyboarding that's part of it. And generally, most of our controls don't have very specific app-like functions that are part of a unique set. Oftentimes they'll mix the two, and that's where you would say, well, because there's a link in here or some other item in here, we need to just go back to a disclosure. So it's very rare that we would use this. I think actually during the audit, the front end team found maybe one instance that might use this. So that is pretty rare. Okay. Last part here is the design. And we're also going through a revamp of the design. We have a direction. It's going to be worked on in Figma, and then we'll get some issues in GitLab UI, et cetera, to kind of go with this. So there's multiple parts of this. Here's what it looks like today, where we have our header for the drop-down panel. We have search very frequently. We have different sections, different types of content, so labels, avatars, etc. Here's that fixed footer. Here might be a fixed header or an action. And with this update, I think we'll be able to achieve a few things. So here's the working update. I'll just toggle back and forth really quick here. So starting top down, the thing is to really unbox this. So we're bringing in the unboxing theme, but also make this a little more usable and consistent across the different use cases. So having an aligned header, having a more global action, where today we have this no milestone or unassigned. These are actions that trigger everything on the control. Having that as more of a top level allows the options to stand alone and to not be essentially pushed down by something that we could interact with at a high level quickly. There is a chevron, or not a chevron, a tip here to point to the referring object. Oftentimes we have icons that will open or close this. So we need to have kind of a visual indicator to help do that. I know Nadia has been working on that with pipelines already. And so we're just making that a global thing. There's better use of space. There's more affordance for what is selected. I'll go over here with a little bit of numbering. So first up, like I mentioned, there's the tip that points to the triggering element. So it's going to be easier to identify what the referring item is. The header is unboxed, so we don't have the border anymore here, either under the header or below any kind of fixed region. And then we have essentially, shadow on scroll. The header text size is reduced, so we're de-emphasizing that, but using bold to keep hierarchy in place, but really focus on the options. There's the universal control, like I mentioned. There's a smaller icon in the search input, and the reason for that is to help with some of the alignment, so that we have a better reading flow, if you will, and a common edge on items, which helps with readability. If you look at our current today, we're going here and over here and here, and so there's a lot of kind of a ragged edge for reading today. This helps to clean that up. Let's see, number 6, yeah, so better edge alignment. Using number 7, a smaller swatch that is more akin to the shape of a label. So rather than the square that we're using today, we can actually kind of have a better UI relationship between what the actual object looks like that you're selecting. Let's see, and then lastly, number 8 would just be increase border radius to account for the selection of options in here. So this is going to be a little more of a modern approach on the navigation, but it also ties back to what we've been doing with the primary nav and some of the work that Austin and Michael Bay have been doing. And so that's just a little detail with the UI there. And so that covers where we're headed with design. Next steps to wrap this up, there's going to just be ongoing refinements. So getting us from today to tomorrow with our variants and options, keeping the design updates incorporated. And then the last step would be component migration. So working on actually updating instances in the product with the updated variants and capabilities. So that's a wrap on that. Thank you for listening.